6 real-life encounters where instinct met nature's raw power. From frozen oil rigs to alpine ridges, these terrifying moments reveal how close we live to the wild and how fast everything can unravel when a bear appears. Raw, intense, and unforgettable, each story reminds us that survival can come down to just seconds. Watch what happens next. The sky over Ussuri Krai was soft with morning haze on June 1st, 2025, the pale sun filtering through drifting mist. The air was cool, thick with the scent of damp pine and churned soil. A small TV crew had set up for a live segment just off a logging trail in a cleared stretch of forest. The nature series aimed to bring public attention to rewilding projects in Russia's Far East, an area both breathtaking and unpredictable. The show's host, Lena Baranova, stood poised before the camera in a windbreaker and jeans. 38 years old, a seasoned presenter known for her calm energy, she spoke into the lens with practiced ease. To her left stood Dr. Irina Mirova, a tall and lean field ecologist in her early 40s, with a worn backpack hanging from one shoulder. She had spent her life studying predator behavior in the Russian wilderness. Beside her was 26-year-old Katya Lebedeva, an assistant producer just starting, holding cue cards and an earpiece. It was her first assignment in the field. The segment had begun without issue. They discussed recent grizzly activity in the buffer zone behind them, where thick underbrush met forested slopes. Irina explained the effects of habitat disruption, while Lena gestured toward claw marks on a tree trunk. Katya stepped forward to show a trail map, unaware that something massive was already watching them. Just beyond the clearing, a massive, dark-furred, agitated Russian male grizzly moved through the low brush with unsettling silence. The newly cut logging road ran straight through its range. That morning, the whine of distant machinery and the scent of diesel had set the bear on edge. It had been following the trail, disoriented, trying to avoid the noise. Then it heard voices, human, too close, and turned toward them. At 9:41 a.m., as Irina pointed out signs of recent scat on the path, the bear erupted from the green wall behind them. Branches cracked like bones snapping. A shadow surged from the brush, and the serene broadcast turned into chaos within seconds. The camera jolted violently as the cameraman screamed and backed away. The screen tilted sideways, showing a blur of trees, flailing limbs, and then the flash of fur. Lena turned at the last instant, eyes wide, lips parted mid-sentence. The bear struck her first. A thunderous swipe threw her against the trail's edge like a rag doll. She hit the ground hard and didn't move. Katya tried to run, but barely got 2 steps before the bear crashed into her. Its weight slammed her down, claws raking across her side. Her scream tore through the clearing as she kicked wildly, her hands pushing against the earth. The bear reared up and came down again, this time across her legs, tearing muscle and cloth in a single brutal motion. Irina didn't hesitate. She yanked her heavy backpack around and hurled it at the bear as it rose to strike again. It connected with a thud, and the bear turned, just enough for Katya to crawl backward, blood trailing in the dirt. Irina used herself as a wall, stepping between the bear and the 2 younger women, waving her arms, her voice rising in a fierce roar of defiance. The bear lunged, its jaws closed around the pack on Irina's chest, crushing plastic and canvas. She stumbled back, keeping her footing only by grabbing a nearby branch. The bear struck her leg, its claws sinking deep into muscle. She dropped hard, kicking at its face as it moved in again. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Breathing heavily, its flanks rising and falling, the bear swung its head toward the forest. Something, a new sound, maybe the whir of the crew's drone starting up, spooked it. With a final low grunt, it turned and bolted into the trees, crashing through the undergrowth with terrifying speed. The silence that followed was broken only by shallow breathing and distant shouts as the crew emerged from behind equipment cases and trees. The pale and shaking cameraman called for help through the satellite phone. Blood soaked the trail. Lena was unconscious, her jacket torn and her scalp bleeding badly. Katya clutched her shredded thigh, sobbing, her face ghost pale. Irina sat slumped against a fallen log, her hands slick with blood, her eyes fixed on the brush where the bear had vanished. Emergency responders reached them within 30 minutes. A medical helicopter landed in a nearby clearing, kicking up needles and dust. The women were stabilized on the spot. Lena had suffered a fractured collarbone and deep lacerations across her back and scalp. Katya's leg was nearly destroyed, muscle and tissue torn to the bone, but she remained conscious through the entire ordeal. Irina's leg was ripped open, but she never let go of her ruined backpack. All three were rushed to a hospital in Vladivostok and placed into surgery that afternoon. Word of the attack spread fast. The raw footage, abruptly cut mid-broadcast, caused a storm of speculation online. The network withheld the video, but a statement confirmed the bear attack and that all three women were alive. Over the following days, officials reviewed the incident. Critics demanded why the crew had been placed close to known bear territory without armed guards or early detection systems. Environmental agencies emphasized the importance of respecting bear behavior, especially during early summer, when territories shift rapidly due to food and noise. Irina, still recovering, wrote an account describing how the bear's appearance matched that of a previously collared male known to patrol the area. Wildlife teams began tracking it again, but no official decision was made regarding intervention. The forest remained closed to media projects for the rest of the season. The scars on the women's bodies would heal slowly. Lena returned to television months later, visibly changed, but determined. After multiple surgeries, Katya began writing about wilderness safety from her hospital bed. Though walking with a limp, Irina returned to the forest within the year, refusing to let fear undo a lifetime of work. The attack lasted less than 90 seconds, but in those seconds, the forest reminded them it was not a backdrop or a theme. It was alive, unpredictable, and, in that moment, more powerful than anything they had prepared for. The river cut through the heart of Kodiak Island like a moving mirror, cold and fast even in late summer. Green hills rolled down to the water's edge, lined with alders and thick brush. It was a remote country, wild and rarely disturbed, where wildlife biologist Anna Carter had spent the last 4 weeks tracking a female Kodiak bear and her 2 cubs. Anna, 35, had spent most of her adult life in bear country. Tall, soft-spoken, and methodical, she knew the rules. Watch from a distance, stay downwind, never get between a sow and her cubs. Along with her assistant, Jason Ward, she had been monitoring the sow's movements from a blind across the river. The bears had a routine, moving from the deeper woods to the gravel bars each morning, fishing for salmon where the current narrowed. That day, August 29, 2024, the air smelled of wet moss and the sharp tang of spawning fish. The cubs had followed their mother toward a bend downstream, partially hidden by brush. Jason was adjusting the rangefinder while Anna recorded notes. Then something broke the rhythm. A figure appeared in the water, tumbling through the rapids, arms flailing, gasping as the current shoved him downstream. It was a hiker, young, dressed in soaked outdoor gear, struggling to stay upright in the thigh-deep current. He stumbled onto a gravel bar, clutching a submerged branch, his knees buckling as the current slammed against him. Anna's instincts fired. She dropped her notebook, slung off her pack, and began moving. Jason looked up, startled, and called after her, his voice sharp. But she was already crossing the river, boots plunging into the icy water. Her eyes stayed locked on the hiker, his face pale, lips blue, half collapsed and still in danger of slipping back in. What Anna couldn't see, what Jason saw from the blind, was the bear. The sow had stopped mid-step when the commotion started. She had been close, much closer than either of them realized, hidden in the dense brush upstream of the bend. Her cubs huddled behind her as she rose on her hind legs, ears pivoting toward the splashing. Then she dropped down, muscles coiled, and began to charge. The Kodiak sow exploded from the underbrush like a missile. She barreled down the bank, leapt across shallow water, and sprinted directly toward the gravel bar. Jason shouted again, waving his arms, but the wind drowned his cries. Anna was halfway across when she saw the movement. Brown fur, massive shoulders, the bear coming fast, but she couldn't move fast enough. She turned her body toward the hiker, waving him off, and then looked back just in time to see the bear hit her. The impact threw her backward, her boots slipping on the rocks. The sow's claws came down across her shoulder and chest, slicing through her jacket, flesh, and bone in one brutal motion. Anna fell, her breath leaving her in a broken gasp, hands flailing toward the rocks as the bear loomed over her. The sow didn't hesitate. She struck again, raking her claws down Anna's side, tearing through muscle. Her jaws snapped, catching Anna's forearm as she tried to shield herself. Blood splashed the gravel. The sow growled low and furiously, her eyes fixed on Anna like she was nothing more than a threat that had to be ended. The hiker screamed from the far edge of the bar but didn't move. Jason was running now, crossing the river upstream, still too far away to help. Anna didn't cry out. Her body convulsed once beneath the bear's weight, then stilled. The sow stood over her for a moment longer, huffing, teeth bared. Then she turned away, lumbering back toward the cubs, her duty fulfilled. She paused once to look over her shoulder, then disappeared into the willows with the young ones trotting. Jason reached Anna's side seconds later. Her body was twisted awkwardly, her face streaked with blood and river grit. Her eyes were half open. He dropped to his knees, pressed a trembling hand against her throat, but there was nothing left to feel. Rescue crews arrived nearly an hour later. Using a satellite beacon clipped to his vest, the hiker had made it across the bar and up the far bank. He was unharmed, except for bruises and mild hypothermia. He told authorities he'd slipped while following a game trail, lost his footing, and been swept into the river. He never saw the bear until it was too late. Anna's body was recovered that evening, carefully lifted from the gravel bar by helicopter. Her wounds were consistent with a defensive attack, a high-speed charge, a violent strike, and a swift retreat. The bear hadn't fed, hadn't lingered. It had simply responded to a perceived threat near its cubs. Authorities declined to take action against the bear. Biologists and officials reviewed the data and determined the sow had acted in natural defense. She hadn't stalked or hunted. She had protected. The decision was met with quiet acceptance by most of the wildlife community. It was the kind of risk every field biologist lived with, though few paid such a high price. Anna's death struck hard. She was experienced, well-trained, and deeply respected. Tributes poured in from conservation groups, universities, and research partners. Colleagues described her as measured, unflinching, and deeply devoted to the ecosystem she worked in. Her family held a small memorial in Anchorage. Jason, who'd worked beside her for 6 years, didn't speak publicly but returned to the field weeks later. The hiker left Kodiak the next morning. He gave a brief statement to officials and was never named in the press. Witnesses said he looked haunted. The gravel bar where Anna died remains unmarked. Weeks later, the sow and her cubs were sighted moving upriver toward the hills. Life went on in the woods, indifferent to the human loss. But for those who knew Anna, the river's cold voice now carried something heavier, an echo of a mistake made from compassion, a warning wrapped in tragedy, and a memory of a life lost in the space between instinct and wildness. The sun hung low over the trees as Mark Stevens paddled his canoe toward the rocky shoreline of a secluded lake in northern British Columbia. He had been traveling solo for 5 days, part of a summer expedition cataloging bear foraging behavior in the region's remote backcountry. The journey had been long and hot, and now, as the lake reflected the clear sky and shimmering blues, Mark decided to stop and cool off. He was 51, lean and weathered, a seasoned biologist who had spent more time among wild animals than people. With 2 decades of fieldwork behind him, he understood the rhythms of nature, respected its dangers, and rarely took risks. His camp was set 100 meters back in the trees, his bear spray secured beside his food stash, which was strung between 2 trees in standard backcountry fashion. The air was silent, except for birdsong and the occasional splash of fish near the shoreline. Mark pulled the canoe onto a stretch of smooth gravel and removed his boots. He stripped off his shirt, sweat-soaked from the long paddle, and waded slowly into the water. It was cold and clear, sending shocks up his legs, but refreshing. He stepped deeper until the water reached his waist and paused, taking it in. The view, the peace, the solitude, moments like these made the hardships worth it. Then, without warning, he heard a deep snort. He turned toward the shore just as a massive grizzly emerged from the brush near the waterline. The bear was huge, likely a mature male, its fur dark and matted from a recent roll in the moss. It moved with heavy purpose, heading straight toward the lake, not yet seeing him. Mark froze. His mind raced through what he knew. Don't startle, don't flee, don't provoke. But before he could ease backward into the water, the bear lifted its nose, sniffed the air, and locked eyes with him. The change was instant. The bear lowered its head, huffed once, and then charged. Water erupted as Mark splashed backward, heart pounding, limbs flailing in the cold. The bear hit the water's edge in seconds, crashing through shallows with terrifying speed. Mark had no time to reach the canoe. He turned toward the open water, but only managed a few stumbling steps before realizing he couldn't outrun it in water. He turned, raised his arms above his head, and shouted, trying to look large. The bear didn't hesitate. It closed the distance and reared up on its hind legs, towering over him, eyes locked with his. Then it swiped. The paw struck the side of Mark's chest like a hammer. He felt the air explode from his lungs and crumpled backward into the water, ribs cracking under the impact. His head smacked against a submerged rock, stars bursting behind his eyes. He rolled instinctively onto his side, clutching his chest, gasping. The bear dropped onto all fours beside him. It circled him slowly, huffing, head low, sniffing aggressively. Mark knew then he was too close, had intruded on a space the bear already considered its own. Maybe the bear had used this lake regularly. Perhaps it thought Mark was a rival or a threat to whatever scent trail it followed. Mark went limp. He curled onto his side in the shallows, face half submerged, one arm over his head. He didn't move. He didn't breathe too deeply. He played dead, hoping his stillness would convince the bear he was no longer a threat. The bear paused beside him, growled low, and gave one more snort. Then it stepped closer. Its front paw pressed down on Mark's thigh, pinning him, testing him. He bit down on a groan as pain surged through his leg. The bear's breath was hot and sour against his back. For a moment, Mark thought it might bite. Then it backed off. It turned slowly, padded up the bank, paused near the trees, and looked back once. Mark didn't move. A moment later, the bear slipped into the undergrowth and vanished. Mark lay motionless for nearly 5 minutes. His chest burned with each shallow breath. His leg throbbed, his side screamed. The cold of the water was now deep in his bones. But he was alive. When he was certain the bear was gone, he began to crawl. It took nearly an hour to reach the edge of his camp. Each movement sent stabbing pain through his ribs. His shirt, draped over a fallen log, was soaked with lake water and stained with blood. He pulled it on with shaking hands. He reached his pack and managed to find his satellite beacon. He triggered the SOS and lay beside it, curled in a patch of moss, waiting. Rescuers arrived by helicopter 3 hours later. Mark was dehydrated, concussed, and suffering from a broken rib and deep bruising across his chest and thigh. They flew him out that night to a hospital in Prince George's. He spent 6 days recovering. Wildlife officials later confirmed that large male grizzlies were known to use that stretch of lake, especially in late summer when they sought cooler places to rest after long foraging sessions. The bear had likely come down expecting solitude and reacted aggressively when surprised. Mark gave a full account of the incident to rangers and researchers. He didn't blame the bear. He knew he'd made a mistake, stepping into a wild animal's routine without realizing it. It was the kind of moment that split time into before and after. He returned home shaken but grateful. The attack could have been fatal. One more swipe, one bite, 1 second of hesitation. But it hadn't been. He'd survived and the bear had moved on. Still, the memory of its eyes, its weight, its breath, those stayed with him. And so did the lesson. Even in beauty, the wild holds its own rules. Snow groaned beneath Ethan's crampons as he descended the narrow pass in the Alaska Range. It was early afternoon in mid-May, the sun high but the wind sharp. The slope was steep, funneled between jagged rock walls with loose snow piled high after a storm the night before. Ethan had climbed this region twice before, but this solo ascent had pushed deeper into isolated territory. A seasoned mountaineer at 37, he knew the terrain well, understood the mountain's moods, and rarely took chances. The descent had started smoothly, but each step down the pass sent a soft crackle through the crusted snowpack. He paused often, reading the surface, checking for tension. He was almost clear of the chute when he heard a muffled pop high above. He froze. A second later, the slope above him fractured with a deep, low growl. Snow shifted. Then came the roar. The avalanche struck without ceremony. It wasn't massive but fast, racing down the gully in a thundering white wave. Ethan threw himself against a boulder, wedging his ice axe into a crevice and bracing as snow exploded around him. Powder filled the air, blinding and suffocating. Chunks of ice struck his shoulders and legs. He held tight, muscles straining until it passed. When the sound faded, the world fell silent again. Snow clung to his jacket. His pack had been torn halfway open, scattering gear. He stood slowly, shaken but intact. Then he saw movement in the swirl of snow just downslope. At first he thought it was rock or debris, but then it rose to its feet, a large, disoriented grizzly. It staggered slightly, its thick fur coated in snow. Its eyes darted across the slope, nostrils flaring. It had been caught in the same avalanche. The bear looked dazed, confused by the sudden chaos. Then it turned and saw Ethan. For a second, both stood still. Neither moved. The ledge they shared was narrow, just wide enough for one to pass without confrontation. But the bear's panic surged first. Its muscles tensed, its ears lowered. It charged. Ethan reacted without thought. He pivoted and threw himself sideways, landing hard on the icy slope. A sharp crack burst in his left arm as it hit the rock. Pain flared white-hot. He slid a few feet, snow scraping his face, until his boots caught on a lip of stone. The bear skidded to a halt where he'd stood seconds before. It loomed above, growling low, claws digging into the snow. Ethan clutched his broken arm and stared up, barely breathing. But the bear didn't finish the charge. It stood there panting, its sides heaving from fear and exertion. Snow dripped from its belly. Its eyes shifted left and right, as if reassessing the scene. There was no clear path forward or threat from the injured man below. After a few long seconds, it turned. The bear stepped slowly across the ledge into a patch of low alpine trees jutting from the cliff's edge. It disappeared into the brush, leaving a trail of crushed branches and melting snow behind. Ethan exhaled shakily. He rolled onto his back, cradling his arm. The pain throbbed deep, grinding through the bone. He pulled his pack close with his good hand, fumbling for his radio beacon. It took effort, but he managed to activate the emergency signal. Then he lay still, staring at the sky, heart hammering. It took 4 hours for rescuers to reach him by helicopter. He was airlifted out with a fractured humerus, bruised ribs, and mild hypothermia. Doctors later said the fall might have killed him if he hadn't managed to land partially on his side. The bear, they said, had likely been foraging near the slope when the avalanche broke loose and was simply reacting to terror and confusion. Ethan replayed the moment in his mind for days, the avalanche, the sudden appearance, the charge. He'd encountered bears on trails, seen them across valleys or downriver while camping, but never like this, never so sudden, never so raw. The incident became a rare recorded encounter where a natural disaster directly triggered a human-wildlife confrontation. Wildlife experts used the case to highlight how climate conditions and wilderness hazards, avalanches, landslides, floods, could drive animals into unexpected contact with people, often with tragic consequences. In this case, neither man nor bear had intended to cross paths. The mountain had simply thrown them together. Ethan recovered over the next several months. His arm required surgery and physical therapy. The pain faded, but the memory lingered. He knew how close he'd come. Had the bear followed through, had it not hesitated, his story would have ended on that icy ledge. He once spoke about it at a climbers' conference, describing how nature could stack unpredictable dangers into a single instant. An avalanche, a fall, a charging predator. There was no time to think, no time to reason. Survival had come down to seconds and luck. The following year, he returned to the Alaska Range, not to climb but to hike the lower valleys, studying changes in snow patterns and animal behavior. He walked slowly, watched the terrain, and carried the weight of the mountain's lesson in every step. There was no fear, just respect, and silence where the snow once roared. Kevin Mulroney had worked on oil rigs for over a decade. At 34, he'd spent the last 2 years stationed on the offshore Arctic rig known as Platform Vega, a skeletal maze of metal perched over the frozen sea, its engines humming steadily through the polar silence. In early September 2024, daylight lingered well past midnight, casting a cold silver glow over the horizon. Kevin stepped outside during one of those long, quiet days. A supply drop had been delayed due to thick fog drifting in from the northwest. With the chopper grounded and most of the crew in the galley or monitoring equipment inside, Kevin wandered toward the helipad for a breath of cold air. He carried his phone, eager to snap a photo of the vast, fractured sea ice stretching into the distance. It looked like a different planet, shards of white broken by streaks of open water, the stillness heavy. He walked slowly toward the platform's edge, where the deck met the helipad. That's when he saw it, movement near the far end of the landing zone. At first, he thought it was something blowing in the wind. Then it shifted again, rising slightly, long and low to the ground. A white shape against white, made visible only by the subtle twitch of muscle and the flash of dark eyes. A polar bear. Kevin froze. The bear had made its way onto the rig, likely drifting in overnight on a block of sea ice. With the melt accelerating year by year, such fragments floated further and longer than before, bearing starving animals into unfamiliar places. The rig had no fencing, no real barrier to something determined, and this bear was desperate. It turned and saw him. Kevin's breath caught. The bear's head rose fully, ribs pushed against its skin. Its fur looked thin, stained yellow from salt and grime. It had not eaten in days. The instant its black eyes locked onto him, it moved slowly, then in a low, jolting sprint across the slick deck. Kevin turned to run. His boots pounded the metal floor, every step an echo swallowed by wind. He rounded a corner, heading back toward the main hatch, but the cold had formed a thin layer of ice in shaded areas. One wrong footfall, and he slipped. His body slammed onto the deck. Pain shot through his elbow. He scrambled, trying to rise, but the bear was already on him. A crewman nearby, Mateo Alvarez, a maintenance tech from Chile, heard the commotion and rushed from the side corridor. Seeing the charging animal, he grabbed the nearest object, a red fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, and pulled the pin. He sprinted toward them, spraying the cloud of white chemical mist across the deck, yelling instinctively, the nozzle waving wildly. The bear flinched, shook its head, but didn't retreat. It swiped first. An enormous paw raked across Kevin's back, dragging him partially over the edge of the deck grating. His parka tore. The next blow struck his head and neck. Then the bear lowered its jaws. Mateo kept spraying, stepping closer, trying anything. But the bear was beyond deterrence. Hunger had drowned out its fear. The attack lasted only seconds. When more crew arrived, banging on pipes and setting off noise alarms, the bear finally backed away. It loped across the deck, circled briefly, then disappeared down a side ramp toward the lower service levels. The rig went into lockdown. Personnel sealed all access points. Alarms echoed through every floor. By the time they reached Kevin, he was motionless. They moved his body inside with care, but there was no hope. The medical team pronounced him dead from trauma and blood loss. His parka was shredded. The expression on his face was frozen somewhere between shock and pain. Wildlife officers and Arctic response teams were flown in within hours. Armed specialists tracked the bear to a lower bay where it had taken shelter beneath a maintenance rig. It showed no aggression then. Exhausted, eyes dim, breathing labored. Tranquilizer darts were not needed. The bear collapsed on its own and died hours later. A necropsy revealed severe starvation. No body fat, empty stomach. The animal had likely drifted in from the eastern Kara Sea, over 100 miles away, carried by shifting ice and currents. Experts concluded it had been without a solid meal for weeks, its behavior born of raw, unfiltered desperation. Kevin's death shocked the industry. It was the first recorded polar bear attack on an Arctic oil platform. No one had believed a bear could reach the rig, let alone climb onto the deck undetected. There were no protocols, and no deterrent systems were in place. What had once seemed impossible now felt like an inevitability. Environmental groups and local scientists responded quickly, citing the incident as a grim signal of climate disruption. With sea ice shrinking, bears were being driven farther and longer in search of food. Starved and disoriented, they appeared in villages, work camps, and now, oil rigs. Kevin's family requested privacy, but his brother later spoke at a public forum, calling for mandatory barriers and wildlife alarms on all offshore platforms operating in high-risk regions. He said Kevin loved his job, loved the vast beauty of the North, but no one should die like that, alone, unarmed, cornered by a ghost of the ice. Platform Vega underwent changes in the weeks that followed. Motion sensors were installed, thermal imaging cameras added, and spotlights placed along every access ramp. Most notably, the company revised all outdoor work protocols, requiring armed watch teams during hours of low visibility. There will be no more casual walks on the deck and no more moments stolen for photos, but some damage couldn't be undone. Kevin's name joined a short, tragic list of people who had died in direct contact with wild polar bears, a name written not in the snow, but in memory, etched into an industry now forced to recognize the brutal cost of a warming world. Out there, where ice broke into the open sea, the boundaries between man and beast had begun to vanish, and Kevin had been the first to stand in that thin, dangerous space. Jake Lawson had spent the last 5 days alone in the alpine backcountry of southeastern British Columbia. At 29, he was an experienced climber and solo trekker, drawn to silence and vertical challenges. His route traced a jagged ridgeline above a dense belt of fir and hemlock, well beyond marked trails. He was heading west on the final leg of his loop, his pack light and mind sharp. September had brought cooler nights, thinner air, and a brittle edge to everything. On the 6th morning, Jake moved with practiced rhythm. The wind whispered through the branches below. The ridge rose and fell like a spine of broken rock, no more than 3 feet wide in places, with steep drops on either side. He had just rounded a bend when he stopped cold. 20 feet ahead, a black bear stood among low shrubs clinging to the ridge's crest. It was large, well over 300 pounds, and deeply focused on stripping berries from the branches. Jake's breath hitched. He hadn't seen it earlier. The bear hadn't heard him until now. The animal froze. Its head rose, mouth half open, fur wet with dew. Jake felt the moment thin, every muscle in his body tensing. He knew what to do. Slowly, he raised his arms to appear larger and stood still. He spoke aloud steadily, trying to signal he wasn't a threat. The bear huffed. Its ears twitched. It turned slightly, then took 2 slow steps backward. But it didn't leave. Instead, it lingered near the edge of the bush, watching. Jake took 1 cautious step back, then another. He shifted his boot, the rubber scraping too hard against loose rock. That sound triggered a change. The bear stepped forward, snorting. Not a charge, more a warning, but enough to make Jake tense again. He didn't run. He eased backward, but the narrow ridge gave no margin for error. As he moved, 1 boot slid against a patch of gravel. His balance wavered. He tried to shift his weight, but there was no recovery. He fell. His feet lifted off the ridge. His body twisted sideways, and he crashed into the slope. Sharp rocks tore at his legs as gravity pulled him down the incline. He tried grabbing roots and branches, but the momentum was too great. After 20 feet, his right shoulder struck a protruding boulder with full force. There was a crack, clear and brutal. Pain shot through his upper body like electricity. He tumbled again, then stopped against a stump between 2 rocks. For a moment, the sky spun, then it steadied. He couldn't move his right arm. His collarbone had snapped. Above, the ridge loomed. He heard rustling. Jake tilted his head to see. The bear was still there. It stood at the edge of the slope, sniffing the air. It paced once in a half circle, then paused to look down. Jake didn't move. The pain was excruciating, but he knew any sudden shift could provoke curiosity, or worse. He stayed still, breathing through clenched teeth, heartbeat pounding in his ears. The bear took 1 step toward the slope. Then it stopped. It turned, sniffed again, and vanished into the trees with slow, heavy movements. Jake waited. Minutes passed. The forest was still. No sound except the wind in the pines and the occasional rustle of birds overhead. When he was sure the bear was gone, he exhaled shakily and reached for the strap of his backpack with his good hand. It took time, fumbling awkwardly, but he managed to pull free the small satellite beacon from a side pocket. He flipped the cover and pressed the emergency button. The device blinked red. Relief came in waves, but he was far from safe. The slope was cold and damp, and the rock pressed hard beneath his back. Every movement sent sharp jabs through his chest. He removed his gloves and laid them under his head to reduce pressure. Hours passed. The sun shifted above the ridge, casting shadows across the basin. He sipped from his water bottle sparingly, knowing help would come, but not fast. He drifted in and out of a light daze, pain keeping him conscious but groggy. The trees rustled once. His eyes snapped open, scanning, but nothing emerged. No growls, no snapping twigs. By early evening, he heard the thump of rotor blades echoing over the hills. He raised his working arm weakly. A red jacket leaned out the open side of the rescue chopper, scanning the slope with binoculars. Moments later, they spotted him and descended with a harness and stretcher. Medics worked swiftly, stabilizing his neck and shoulder before winching him into the air. Jake was airlifted to a hospital in Cranbrook. X-rays confirmed a clean break of the collarbone, several cracked ribs, and deep bruises along his lower back. He would recover fully, but the pain and shock stayed with him longer than the injuries. Forest rangers visited him 2 days later. They had tracked fresh bear scat and prints on the ridgeline and confirmed late-season activity in the region. A poor berry yield in the valleys had driven multiple black bears higher than usual, extending their foraging range dangerously close to human paths. Jake recounted everything: the ridge, the bear, and the fall. His body tensed as he described the moment the bear looked down at him, not aggressively but with something unreadable. The ranger said he had done everything right. He hadn't run, he hadn't provoked. It had just been a bad moment in a narrow place, and the bear had reacted like a wild animal protecting its feeding ground. Jake stayed off the ridges for a while, but he didn't stop climbing. He later wrote that the bear hadn't attacked, it hadn't chased, but its presence had still changed everything. He understood now that danger in the wild wasn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it was just a shadow too close on a narrow ledge. One breath, one slip, one twist of fate away from disaster.